Okay, thank you, Tom. Just a question for how many people work here on the diagnostic side? And how many on the pharma side? That's a good representation of both. So I'm going to talk about issues regarding co-development strategies, the relationships between pharma and diagnostic companies, and considerations regarding partnerships. And interesting, I had a call, and part of some of the issues I'm going to touch on may be self-evident to many of you, but I had a conversation coming in from the hotel to the conference center this morning with Mark Roberts, and he had actually put me in touch with somebody as a prospective client. And one of the issues is they're thinking about is they don't want to do a companion diagnostic. FDA has told them that they need to develop a co-development strategy, and they still don't think that they need a diagnostic, but have not elected to have that discussion with the agency. And that's some of the issues that I have at certain times in terms of whether a diagnostic, or even the justification in terms of the timing of that discussion. So I always come back to sort of the essential guidance documents, key to guidance document to speak to this very issue, and as a reflection of FDA's policies and practices. I mean, obviously the one on the companion diagnostic guidance document that was issued in 2014, obviously defining what a CDx is, but there were two key aspects of that, and that is that outlining the policy when developing a therapeutic product in which a companion diagnostic is considered essential, and the issue of the need for a contemporaneous review and approval of the therapeutic product and the CDx, with the exceptions, not the rule. The other document that most of you may be familiar with, which I think is a really good document, and it really is an expansion of the companion diagnostic guidance document as it relates to co-development and the various situations that arise relative to co-development of a diagnostic and a drug. And this obviously is more of a realistic approach. It reflects FDA's experiences in terms of expectations, in terms of co-development, and it touches on a number of things. Let me see. I mean, obviously, contemporaneous route and approval, investigational devices, which we've talked about, components of analytical validation, the issue of when early studies you may be using a prototype assay as opposed to the final CDx and the associated bridging studies. When you're using research use only components, the implications of something we were talking about during lunch, the implications of local testing and pre-screening, and a number of other factors as well that I think that I'm not going to go into each one of these, but just it lays out the framework in terms of the expectations of co-development, and where you don't have an ideal approach relative to co-development strategies. The definitions are very clear in terms of what a companion diagnostic is. I mean, we think about it in the context of identifying patients that are most likely to benefit. That's the efficacy component, but there's also a safety component as it relates to companion diagnostic. We think about KRAS and colorectal cancer. The KRAS marker is both a safety marker and an efficacy marker, because if you give the drug to patients with the mutation for colorectal cancer, they sometimes will have a worse outcome than the placebo itself. The other thing that we don't think of very often is the monitoring component of that. And one example that I can think about is this: what is discontinuation for, obviously scheduling and dosing, but discontinuation. We had a program when I was at Novartis, and this is something that's in the public domain, but using one of their drugs for CML, which is almost a drug that has cured patients with chronic myelogenous leukemia, and using the BCR-ABL transcript. In this case, they were taking people off the drug and using BCR-ABL transcript levels to determine whether they've had an effective response, and they can essentially a discontinuation study. That test was considered a companion diagnostic and subject to the CDx requirements. There's also, we all tend to think of things maybe in a more of an FDA-centric way, but there is a global dimension in terms of companion diagnostic, and the definitions, I'm not going to read through these, But the definitions, Japan and the US, are very similar, as is the final EU regulation that has a carve-out for companion diagnostics. The definitions are similar as well. The only difference is that there's a specific provision saying it doesn't apply to monitoring, which is a component of the FDA and the Japan definitions. So as you look at the guidance document is very clear, is that the FDA emphasizes the need that the test should be developed and approved contemporaneously and to be available when the registered therapeutic product is approved. Aaron pointed out the fact that the issue of a CDx or not is one that's driven by the therapeutics center, not by CDRH. CDRH's role is really to determine whether the test has been properly validated, is met all the appropriate requirements to ensure its safety and effectiveness. Further noted is provision is that if FDA determines the companion diagnostic device is essential to be safe and effective in the use of the therapeutic product or indication, FDA will not generally approve the therapeutic product or new therapeutic product indications if the companion diagnostic device is not approved and cleared for that indication. So the issue and the emphasis on contemporaneous approval and what is essential. I mean, that is also defined as when the use of a diagnostic device is required in the labeling of a therapeutic product for selection of appropriate patients or therapy to select or patients who should not use the product, or for monitoring to achieve safety and effectiveness, that diagnostic device is considered essential. Now there's the component in terms of expectations regarding contemporaneous review and approval. However, there's exceptions, and the provisions are called out in the guidance itself in terms of where there are those exceptions. You know, there may be no it's developing an unmet need, no satisfactory alternative exists. The benefits far outweigh the risks. This is an approach that must be reviewed by both centers in advance, and there may be a simple fact is that your study is moving so quickly, including a phase 1 study, for example, that you may not be able to do a contemporaneous review and approval. But the simple fact remains is that you still are, FDA does expect subsequently that the diagnostic will be approved and the drug label will be revised to stipulate that. Now, we look at some legacy issues, and legacy issues should not be used as a basis for defining forward-thinking regulatory policy. I mean, some of you may be familiar with this product, and this was back in 2007, where Pfizer had a drug for HIV tropism, and Monogram, which I believe is now owned by LabCorp, had a test to assess HIV tropism as a basis for identifying patients that would get this drug. And essentially, the FDA permitted the LDT to serve as the companion diagnostic for this device. Subsequently, FDA noted on record that the practice of allowing LDTs to be a CDx that are essential, the word essential again, without FDA approval is a practice that will not be repeated. That an LDT that falls into the scope of a companion diagnostic will require pre-market review. So I've had clients using this as an example of why they don't need a CDx, and obviously legacy issues don't count anymore in these kind of circumstances. And obviously, if we think about Myriad Genetics and the BRCA1, BRCA2 test to get approval for the AstraZeneca drug, Parza, for ovarian cancer, that was the first LDT companion diagnostic that was approved by FDA. In 2016, Pfizer got FDA approval for Xalkori for ROS1, phase 1 data about ROS1 mutations, and they got the drug approved without a concurrent approved companion diagnostic. And I remember attending a conference where somebody saying, well, FDA is now being more flexible of not requiring a companion diagnostic for this drug based on this recent announcement. They were partially correct. Yes, it was phase 1 data, 50 patients. The drug was approved. There wasn't a companion diagnostic available for approval at the time. There was a post-marketing commitment and subsequent companion diagnostic approval in the Oncomine test. A very similar situation with Keytruda. I'm not going to speak much to this, but there was a approval for their expanded indication based on first tissue site agnostic indication for a CDx. Ken Emancipator is going to touch on this, but this also was a post-marketing commitment. Didn't require contemporaneous approval, but it was a post-marketing commitment. So the emphasis is that there are limited, there are exceptions, limited exceptions in terms of the requirements of having a companion diagnostic approved with your therapeutic. You know, just because you're an orphan drug, because it's a rare disease or breakthrough therapy, doesn't offer an exception to this requirement of achieving and requiring a companion diagnostic. And one of the things that I see in terms of companies trying to defer their decision, I had one client say, well, we want to do what Merck did in terms of doing a post-marketing commitment. And I said, well, you know, you're not talking about, FDA's told you need a companion diagnostic, and you're planning, your timeline shows that you're supposed to file your NDA in about 3 years. I don't think that's going to sit very well with the agency if you take that approach, because you certainly have sufficient time to develop a CDx and sufficient time to ensure concurrent review and approval. So bearing that all in mind is that when you bring these two parties together, drug development is complex. Diagnostic development and companion diagnostic development is complex. When you bring them both together, it gets very complex. And we think about this in a very simple context, and that is that if you're dealing it from the drug side, they're accustomed to biomarker qualification. But something that was discussed in some of the earlier discussions, certainly something FDA brought up, is biomarker qualification isn't in vitro diagnostic validation, because from an FDA regulatory standpoint, they're looking at the complete system, not just the reagents used to identify the marker. They're looking from the time you collect the samples, how you extract the DNA, the methodology associated with that, the analytical component, the reporting software, and how the results reported. So the complete system, it's what is reviewed by FDA. And bear in mind that those of us that have lived in the diagnostic world know that de novo development can take 2 to 4 years, depending upon the complexity of your technology. The other aspect of it is you throw in all the other issues regarding quality systems, standards, and the like, including design control. These obviously add to the components relative to complexity. Notwithstanding all those facts, there clearly needs to be the close alignment of teams from the start in terms of getting this right. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but just sort of establishes a very complex framework in terms of those of us who come from the diagnostic world. This is nothing that's new to them, a very formalized approach in terms of design control, establishing specifications and very detailed requirements as it relates to analytical and clinical performance in the whole component in terms of system development. This is something that on the pharma side they don't necessarily realize in terms of the complexity of diagnostic development. So when you bring these two parties together, it's very, very important that these teams, both on the CDx partner side and the pharma side, it's a very coordinated approach between both parties. But it's the pharma team that established the overarching program objectives and timelines, which the CDx partner must work towards. It's the drug timelines. the end game in all of this is that, despite what maybe some CDx partners may think, the end game in all of this is it's about drug approval that results in employing a regulatory compliant and reproducible companion diagnostic test. It is all about the drug. In obviously the partners you choose and the level of oversight that's necessary is all dependent upon the technology and their prior CDx experience. In any case, when you're putting together an agreement in relative, the deliverables in the agreement should be clearly defined in any agreement you have in terms of this relationship, including issues in terms of health authority interaction. I remember one client, the CDx partner, said, you don't need to have any input in terms of our discussions with CDRH. Well, that's not an acceptable thing because you are talking about our drug when you're having a discussion with CDRH. And so it's a collaborative effort and not one where parties work in separate ways. And I liked the comment, and I can't take credit for it, but it was at a meeting with FDA involving a companion diagnostic, and with CDRH. Steve Gutman said to me, don't let the test hold the drug hostage. And I think it's an important way to think about these things. From a team standpoint, ensure that there is either on the pharma side, ensure that there's CDx representation or direct linkage to the therapeutic pharma program teams. In many cases, you will form program teams and steering committees as it relates to the relationship, and these are usually carved out in the agreements. There is a separate CDx team that's obviously formed and led by the partner to support delivering an aligned CDx for the most part. Strong coordination between health authorities is very important. We had the luxury, when I was at Novartis, and that my CDx regulatory group reported into the head of drug regulatory, so there was a very good coordination between our drug regulatory counterparts in terms of health authority meetings, both on the therapeutic side as well as on the diagnostic side. The CDx Regulatory Affairs owns the diagnostic timelines and deliverables, but it must still be linked tightly to the therapeutic global clinical study and regulatory timelines. One of the things that I think is in working with clients is that they may set a timeline and may be very aggressive to start the first clinical trial, let's say first patient, first visit, and they're saying, well, we're going to start our trial in June of 2018, let's just say, but it could be delayed another 3 months. I think from a partnership relationship, you have to work towards that aggressive schedule as opposed to saying, well, we may have an additional 3 months in terms of our co-development strategy. A hands-off approach is not recommended on the drug side. So when we're thinking about partnerships and partnership selections, there are a couple of components that I'm thinking about. Is really looking at the technology and a company analysis, their performance and regulatory issues, as well as the operationalizing the technology in the company's clinical development plan. And so if you're looking at partners, you don't know who you're going to utilize. You're maybe looking at somebody that's experienced versus someone that may be less experienced. You really need to, unless it's somebody that you've worked with in the past, there's a certain level of due diligence and sometimes some strong due diligence that you need to employ in terms of doing a quantitative assessment of the potential partner. Looking at the gaps, are there risks in any associated remediation? What are the core competencies of the organization? If they're just starting out, what are their hiring plans and hiring the right people? Can they deliver a PMA and can they support a global strategy? What are the key advantages and the associated risks of the technology? Similar issues regarding regulatory. What's their regulatory experience? Do they have experience with IDE issues? I have one client right now that they've chosen a lab and their study was significant risk. They chose a lab that couldn't do an IDE. Their study was significant risk. They revised their study, so it was non-significant risk. Now they have to go back and do a significant risk trial, and they have a partner that doesn't have the capabilities to do an IDE, so that burden is going to fall on the pharma partner, the pharma company that has limited experience. And so that was doing some due diligence beforehand. So I'm running out of time here, 5 more minutes. Similar things in terms of on the operational side, the way you think about these things. So in my mind, to de-risk the company's drug registration strategy, I think there's some
principles you should follow when selecting platforms, LDTs, and partners. If possible, use mature, low-risk technologies if that's possible. If you can use a single IHC test versus a complex NGS platform, if that meets your needs, then maybe that's the right decision for you in the immediate term, and maybe there's a long-term strategy. At the same time, technology has advanced rapidly and are now CDx compliant. And we look at the recent developments in 2016, 2017, as it relates to NGS technologies that have certainly afforded themselves to be employed in a CDx strategy with companies that can certainly stand the muster in terms of FDA approval as well as a global strategy. I would state that you should avoid anchoring your pivotal studies on IVD medical devices that are in the research or development stage that are not yet established for clinical diagnostic use. This can create risk for your program, potentially impact contemporaneous review and approval. There's been a lot of talk about liquid biopsy, circulating tumor DNA, definitely a place and an opportunity for that, but is it the right approach for you from a predictive standpoint for the specific disease or area? That's something that you really have to look at. Obviously, choosing a research-based technology or even certain LDT approaches may require you to be more involved in the development process. It could stretch your bandwidth, and is that something that you want from a CDx partner standpoint? LDT is certainly a viable strategy. The only issue as it relates to LDT is does it provide limited flexibility from a global standpoint? And that's something that you obviously, if you're going to partner with an LDT company, that's one of the questions that you want to have because of the IVD regulation that has a carve out for even if impact, the new IVD regulation in Europe that impacts laboratory developed tests, as well as Japan doesn't think about LDTs in the way that we do in the U.S. We already discussed these two issues in the panel discussion and earlier. So thinking about this is that, what is key in thinking about a diagnostic partner? What is ideal? Well, you have a shared vision in chemistry with the organization. I've been involved with a relationship where the chemistry was really bad, and you only work with that partner because you had no choice. That's not that was not a partnership. Has full capability to meet your needs. Has a track record in technical competence and FDA cleared approved CDx development and manufacturing. Has a track record in terms of global regulatory submissions, including being the ability to do IDEs or PMAs. Has a track record, we think about this, the market access, post-marketing issues, how important is that, including reimbursement. The issue in terms of customer launch and support. And potentially has technologies that you are selecting that are well established as a diagnostic device. So that's an ideal partner. What's a partner that's not so ideal? Well, it's somebody that's still trying to define how to define itself in the marketplace. It's still on a journey. Still building one of these, still trying to build itself and build a team to support a CDx strategy. They have yet to develop a medical device that is new, unique, or different. It's an organization that may place considerable demands on your organization and its resources. And the issue in conducting de novo development with it's going to conduct de novo development with no prior IVD experience. Questions that you should ask. So one of the ways that, there's one of the ways in terms of assessing them is looking at partners and rating them relative to their capabilities. If they meet the capabilities, you give them a 1. If they don't, it's a 0. And this is something that we've done in terms of assessing partners. And you come up with a list, and it may not be the final decision, but you're going to separate the good partners from the bad partners in terms of if you add up all these capabilities and, not meeting one capability is not a problem, but not meeting multiple capabilities can be problematic as it relates to your CDx diagnostic strategy and co-development strategy and partnership. So I'll leave you with this final thought, and this is a quote from Richard Pazdur of FDA back in 2010 at a panel meeting. "Attention has to be paid to these in vitro diagnostics. They are not just something to put off that someone else will do." Now that was in 2010. And I said, should I put this slide up? Because that was 7 years ago. But my experience is this is still as current today as it was in 2010, despite all the CDx advancements, despite all the product approvals, and the defined expectations of FDA. Resistance still remains in some circles, not the players that have had a lot of experience in terms of CDx development, but resistance still remains on timely advancement of a CDx strategy that may be essential to the approval of one's therapeutic. Thank you.
So